I have a question.
Yes, please.
My question for you is believing that there is nothing but God makes perfect sense. God is in us and through us, living through us. My difficulty comes when I look out and I read the news or look at my social media and I see things happening in the world. And I have a lot of resistance to it. Um, just kind of like the things you were talking about, people, groups of people being anti-life. And so how do I come to terms with those two separate things, that God is in and through all of us everywhere all the time, but then also that there are these anti-life entities or energies or groups of people?
That's a really wonderful question and welcome. And thank you for joining us live. I've seen many of your comments on the YouTube channel, Hope for Humanity, and really appreciate them. And I'm happy you're here in person to learn together.
Thank you.
It's a very apropos question because yesterday I was speaking to a group of journalists and news writers about this very subject. And I was speaking from the Torah perspective of how they should properly write the news and contrasting it with the way that the news is written. The way that the news should be reported is to report on the greatness of God Almighty and what is going on in the world as an indication of God Almighty's vision, all the positive things that are going on in the world, and the negative things as consequences of the diversion of the human mind from the recognition of God Almighty. What instead happens in all the news sources, whether it's what people call the mainstream media or the alternative media or the awake media, whatever way that people refer to themselves, they all share the same problem, which they all report in a way to make everything look like it's accidental, it happened, just happened, that there is no God in history, there's no God in the present, and God forbid, there's no God in the future. So when we expose ourselves to the news, we are actually coming directly in conflict of what we innately know, which is that there's a creator. There was once a student in the Talmudic yeshiva, in the Torah yeshiva in the 770, the Lubavitch Rebbe's yeshiva, and he wrote to the Rebbe, he came into the Rebbe and said he was having doubts in his belief in God Almighty. And the Rebbe said, that's because you're reading the news, the New York Times, before you go to sleep. Because the New York Times, as just one example, is written to create the impression that there is no God Almighty creating the world, that the world is accidental, that all these events are just different, they'll ascribe different causes, like you read the stock market report and they'll tell you that the stock went up because of this and the stock went down because of that, and they make up all kinds of excuses, whatever comes to their mind. But they forget that there's a God Almighty that's creating every single thing and at every single instant. So the end result is that your perception of reality is distorted by the news that you're reading. Because you are going to say to yourself, I presume, and as many people would say, they're reading, hopefully you're aiming to get your news from an accurate source, but you think that that is going to give you an accurate perception of reality. And the fact is, it's not, because what it's showing you is a distortion of reality. It's presenting everything as either accidental, or there's no hand of God the way it's presented. And in particular, the news is written to disguise from you that the divine image is in every single human being. So when you read the news accounts, the way the news account is written, you see a description of a person who's portrayed in the media as somehow inherently evil. Now, the way the news should be written is like this. Mr. Jones, I don't want to pick on a Mr. Jones, but Mr. Jones, who was created in God Almighty's divine image, created with the inherent knowledge of his own goodness, who was raised with love by God Almighty at every moment, and has been provided everything he needs from the beginning of from his conception until now, always has been, always will be, is right now, and always will be, tragically lost sight of God Almighty providing everything for him, and in a moment of insanity went into the bank and robbed the bank because he feared that he didn't have enough money and couldn't be able to provide for himself and his family if he didn't rob the bank. And we all, fortunately, the police arrested him to be able to bring him to trial for the transgression of having lost sight of God Almighty in his life and having done something to take property that doesn't belong to him. And if he's not guilty, he'll be acquitted. And if he's guilty, then he will suffer the consequences of that, so that all of us should learn how to conduct ourselves, and even in moments of weakness, not do a similar thing. And we all wish a blessing on the bank teller and the police and the customers that were there and the people who had their money stolen and the people who print the money and the robber himself, because he should also be blessed, because God willing, after all this loving kindness from God Almighty, he is going to come to see the truth, and he will return to God Almighty and dedicate the rest of his life to setting an example of an upright human being created in God Almighty's divine image. Now, that's the truth of the story. Every one of the stories, including the worst people that you can mention in history, whether you want to mention Stalin or Hitler made his name be erased, or Lenin or Mao, or anyone you want to mention, all the same story, including me. When I do something, I forget to do something that I'm supposed to do. We're all exactly in the same situation. It's just a matter of degree, how far a person lets it develop their forgetting about God Almighty. And if you were, blessed with the opportunity to take the opportunity to return to God Almighty. But if you read the news like this every day, you would be so positive. You would think that the world is filled with amazing, wonderful people. 8 billion human beings, all created in God Almighty's divine image. And yes, some of them stumbled yesterday, and this guy robbed the bank, but it's going to be good, and it's going to be a good result. And no one is going to rob the bank after seeing, this, how sad it is what happened to him, because everyone reading the article is reminded that they too are being provided by God Almighty. So now all the people that read the article, instead of thinking, how did he get away? How could I do it better so I don't get caught like him? They'd be thinking, I don't even need to rob a bank because I have everything I need and always will. So the news would actually bring people to a greater awareness of God Almighty. So now back to your question. The news you're reading and we're all exposed to is a distortion of reality, because the writers are promoting the idea that there's something wrong with this guy. And they have this, they're all powerful and they have this evil plan and all these kind of things, and they're out to get everybody. And it could be true, assuming that they're factually accurate and they actually are pinpointing the right people. But even those people are created in God Almighty's divine image. And the Lubavitch Rebbe says that the people who are the greatest opponents of God Almighty right now, the greatest opponents of divine wisdom, the greatest opponents of the Jewish people and all upright human beings, are going to become the greatest proponents and allies and advocates for God Almighty, for the Torah, for the Jewish people, for every single human being. Because they are going to come to recognize that it's okay to admit the truth. And we have to make sure, this is another interesting, important point to recognize, is that whenever we have a division and people are condemning someone else, that closes the door for the other person to return to God Almighty and to feel that he could defect to the side of God Almighty, because everyone's saying they hate him. If you see the person for what they really are, and it becomes so simple for the person to say, wow, that's where the truth is, resonates with him in the midst of all his confused thinking and actions, and he will be able to make that transition to defecting from the cult of scarcity and and aligning himself with the God of abundance and all the good human beings in the world. So that's what we have to be aware of. And I just want to suggest that while we have a temptation to think that we need to know about every negative thing going on, I believe that we could be more productive, more able to uplift people, more able to uplift ourselves and our own family by minimizing our exposure to that information, because the best of it is designed to cast us into turmoil and to begin to disparage other human beings. And the worst of it is outright false information intended to drive us into fear and reactionary moves, which only serve the very people that are executing these unfortunate, tragic, negative plans. They write the script for those that are opposed to them, because they want people to be afraid of them. They want people to believe in their imminent, inevitable victory, God forbid, and therefore people react in all the ways, exactly the way that they are intended by these proponents of these ideas and plans, those ideas and plans. And the end result is people become paralyzed and completely incapable of doing any concerted action to be able to actually put the world on the right path. Our job is to see God Almighty in everything, to see through the concealment. So the more it seems challenging, the more the opportunity is for us to actually see through it. And we know that in the Torah, in the Bible, it talks about the story of Joseph became the second to the king, and his brothers appeared before them, and he wanted to take as a prisoner his youngest brother Benjamin. And so Yehuda, his brother, came to intercede and approached what appeared to him as the vice king of Egypt, the deputy king, the viceroy of Egypt, and challenged him. How dare he take this brother as a prisoner? And what the Torah explains to us is that what Yehuda saw and where the salvation came from is because he saw that everything that was happening was from God Almighty. He didn't know it was his brother, but he knew that this extremely dark, difficult situation, that his family was going to be destroyed. And not only his family, remember, not only his physical family was about to be destroyed, but his whole spiritual world was to be destroyed, because he had promised his father that he would give up his entire spiritual life as a promise, as a pledge, in order to be able to bring back this youngest boy of Jacob. So the whole world was going black spiritually and physically. But he saw that this king who was doing this terrible thing, this deputy king was doing this terrible thing to kidnap his brother basically and take him prisoner, could only exist because God Almighty was giving him existence. He could only speak what God Almighty wanted him to speak at that time. And when it explains that when he starts to tell Joseph, which is actually revealed later as his brother, he starts listing all the things that happened. He starts saying, this happened, and you asked us this, then you asked us that. He wasn't telling this for the sake of Joseph. He was having a conversation with himself to remind himself how everything that happened was from God Almighty. He was precisely where he was because God Almighty had made it be that way. And when he was able to see that and realize the reality of the moment, then that's when Joseph broke down in tears. And there was this revelation that really behind this facade of this terrible dictator was actually a simple human being that was really on the same side as Yehuda, was really actually his brother. And so we can see the power of meeting the challenge of seeing every single situation, every single person as ready, really nothing but God Almighty. There's nothing in existence besides God Almighty. It's also interesting, by the way, now not to in any way excuse anyone's misdeeds, but it's interesting, and it talks about King Saul. King Saul, in a terrible incident when he was pursuing his son-in-law, King David, who he felt was actually anointed to replace him. He killed 60 priests in the city of Nov. It's written in English as N-O-B. But God Almighty forgave him just from having remorse over that. So we don't understand. We're not able to even fathom God Almighty's compassion and his forgiveness. For any of us, we would think if a person, did even one tiniest fraction of such a terrible thing, that it's beyond being forgiven from our perspective. Yet we see that God Almighty forgave him, who of all people should have known better, not to kill, to kill any human being would be terrible, but he killed 60 righteous priests from the children of Israel. How could that possibly be, if we were sitting together and thinking about who needs to be, told that there's no way back, we would think it has to be at minimum this person. But God Almighty forgave him just when the moment of his regret, when he had a feeling of regret inside, God Almighty forgave him. So every human being, no matter what they've done, has that potential to return to God Almighty, and it's God Almighty's decision as to exactly what and how much and so forth is going to be forgiven, and what the process that's going to be. But we are not meant to be walking around thinking that any person is beyond redemption. We have to know that every person has the potential to return to God Almighty, and that gate is always open, and that is for us to point him in that direction. When we point a finger at the person and we start accusing him and we start condemning him and writing articles about how terrible he is and he doesn't deserve any possible forgiveness, we are actually working against what God intends. We should be pointing our finger to that person. We should be pointing that finger, not at that person. We should be pointing that person in the direction of the gates of returning to God Almighty, and encouraging him that he's going to have to deal with God Almighty. It's true, we have to have courts of justice, and we have to implement justice, and if it's necessary, we do have to do that. We're not absolved from the concept of justice and carrying out justice. That's a fundamental foundation of civilization in God Almighty's world. But between him and God, that is something that he has to take up with God Almighty. And we have to let him know that is always open to him.